Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. My name is Matthew Harrison, and I'm talking to you from the heart of Canada. My guest on today's show is Connor Wielgosz, a particularly creative Winnipegger who, with a history of writing stories and musicals, has spent recent years taking on a new venture of starting a business with a friend of his creating card games. Welcome to the show, Connor.
Thanks for having me.
So, when did you get the idea to start making card games?
Way back when I was working at this board game cafe called Across the Board, and I met somebody there named David, and we were both very similar. It's actually how I got the job, is I was pitched to them as another David. The two of us clicked pretty quick, and we had always kind of talked about making games. I think it's something that the two of us had thought about, for a long time, but it just wasn't possible. It's a lot up front to make a game the traditional way. You're ordering tens of thousands of units and shipping and this and that. And so it was always kind of a back burner, like maybe one day we'll do this. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago that it kind of like clicked and we had an idea of like, oh, maybe we could actually just do it ourselves. And so just over a year ago, we started selling them for real, and it's been a dream ever since.
So what was that moment that really inspired you guys to put these ideas into motion?
I mean, it's a couple things. Like David and I, we tend to play a lot of games together, and we tend to gravitate towards things that involve games. So as an example, we both also worked at a place called Activate together, which is kind of a big active gaming center, almost like a human arcade. And so he's the one who actually designs most of the games for the facility. And so when I was working there, I was doing design, but also helping with the game development. So I think we've always naturally gravitated towards that as a kind of creative outlet. I think it's just a natural manifestation of, hey, we like to do this. Why don't we do this in a bit more of a real sense?
Now, how would you describe the kind of games you're making?
Yeah, so basically we make handmade games, which is people don't understand when you say it the first time. So I'll kind of explain. Basically, instead of ordering them from a factory, we make games by printing them ourselves. So we have printers. We design the games. We print them off on the printers. We take those papers. We put them into little, like, what a Cricut is. We use a silhouette. It's very similar, where it's a little tiny blade that you can program to like cut out shapes. And so we cut out our boxes using that. We have little business card cutting machines that originally were hand crank. And so we upgraded from those just because the hand crank ones would like eat the paper every now and again. And then we take those and, fold them up, package them, wrap them ourselves. And so it's a very different type of game when you open it up than what you might be used to with a big box. And we do it for a couple of reasons that we can get into in a bit. But the actual style of games are more like party games. So they are very light. Kind of our focus is less than a minute to learn. That's kind of the big hook. I've played a lot of games. I hate rules. If you could just, take the rules on a USB, plug it in my brain, and I know them, oh, that's the dream. I tend to gravitate towards lighter games. And when we're designing, I find it's a more enjoyable challenge to simplify than it is to add. And so when we're trying to think of games, we're really trying to get them down to the core, the easiest kind of most basic understandable thing so that people can just play and not be thinking about rules while they're playing.
What are a couple of games that come to mind for you that you've made or sold recently?
Yeah, so one of the first ones we launched, which has kind of been one of our big hits, is called Imposters, and it's so straightforward. You get the category, you get the options. One of the options doesn't fit in the category. So, which one of these isn't a real musical instrument or isn't a real, Canadian Prime Minister? Like, there's so many different things that you can do for the categories there. So that was kind of just like people really gravitate towards that one. It's easy to understand. There's another one that's new kind of big hit that we've just launched recently. That's my new favorite because it's the easiest game you'll ever learn, which is called Syllabuster. So basically, I say a prompt, you say an answer. I might say something like name an animal that's green. So you might say frog. And now you get the point unless somebody names an answer with more syllables. So it's really that easy to play. You're just like trying to think of longer and longer answers to these simple prompts. So there's really no limit to who can play because all you need to know is syllables and you can just pull it out at a party and in 15 seconds you're playing a game. That's kind of the feel of the games and some of the more popular ones that we have.
It sounds like you have some games that are pretty broad and some that are a little more Canadian. Do you have a lot of Canadian specific games?
It's funny you ask. We have one game that has been like very, very popular locally, which is our Trivia Mix Manitoba. So we wanted to make a line of trivia games called Trivia Mix, which is basically similar to your classic question answer style, but just with a little more variety and a little more options to choose from as well. So just making the trivia a little more interesting than just question, answer. So we wanted to make one about Manitoba. So we made one all about Manitoba, famous people, places, things, events. Like we really tried to, find as many different great things about Manitoba, which researching it was so much fun because there's so much cool stuff here. Soon, we're actually working on right now a Canadian version of our game Imposters. So we're going to do Imposters Canada, and that one's going to feature all wild things Canadian. I know one of the ones that I'm excited for is Timbit flavors because I love me a Timbit, and there are some weird flavors that have been out. So just fun things like that. And a part of our business is that we are Canadian, right? And we are local, we are Manitoban. So that's a huge part of what we want to focus on with when we're creating games, not only the content that's in the games, but also catering to the market of, there's a lot of Canadians who want games and who want games that are about, our country. So that's something that we are in part inspired to do.
So when you're coming up with a game, is it typically an idea just kind of comes to you out of the blue and you jot it down, or do you spend time brainstorming these kind of ideas?
It's so funny because I've been asked that question in many different forms, and I think most creative people are, like, how do you get your ideas? And I find, at least for me, it's just like, whenever you're doing something that's not thinking about the thing that you're thinking about is usually when you get that inspiration of like, oh, what if this, right? I find, at least, I'm always kind of like out and about doing something completely different. And all of a sudden that idea pops in my head and I pull up my phone and I write the note down. And then later on I go back and I look at it. I think, at least, you don't normally think of those ideas by trying to think about the ideas. You almost just like think of the ideas because some other thing has made a connection in your brain that your brain is ready for, because you're always thinking about this thing, whether it's games here or writers or musicians, I think, find this a lot as well, where it then clicks and you go, oh, okay, I'm taking this other idea, I'm putting it through the filter that my brain is almost an expert in, and then the idea comes out naturally. So that's what I find with mine.
When an idea comes to you like that, do you let the idea be its own thing, or do you feel as though you try to fit it into a template or a certain kind of a pattern that your games follow? Do you kind of let every game be a little more individual than that?
That's actually a really good question. I don't know if I've thought about it a lot. I know that one of the big restrictions that we do have, I think with a lot of people who make games, they really get to do almost whatever they want. One of the big things I think that limits people's creativity when it comes to games is cost, just because they are thinking solely about, I need to sell units for this cost to make a profit, etc. One difference with our games is our games are all the exact same format. They're the same size box, the same number of cards. It's always going to be the same packaging, the exact same look, the exact same size. So we do have a limitation on the types of games that we can create in that format. And we have a lot of ideas that don't work in that format. And that's just a thing where it's like, well, if it can fit, great. And if it can't, we'll just save it for something else. With the games that we come up with, a lot of the times it'll be quite clear quite quickly if the game will work for our current business model. And if not, we can kind of shelve it and think about it as maybe a future plan or some other idea that might inspire a game in the future.
So on that note, what sort of equipment are you working with to make these games now compared to when you started?
Yeah, so hilariously, when we started, part of the fire lit under our butts to start this whole thing is that we were talking about, maybe trying to make games ourselves. And so my best friend David, who I co-run the business with, he just bought a printer one day. And he was like, hey, I saw this printer was on sale. I bought it. And there was almost like this feeling of like, now you spent all this money on a printer. We can't just not do this thing. So that was a real like, okay, let's really figure this out. So the equipment when we started was literally that printer. We had a hand crank business card cutting machine. We were borrowing my brother's Silhouette that he used for vinyl cutting. We basically like looked at other packaging that already existed in terms of glueless packaging. That was kind of a twofold importance. One, we want to be a little more eco-conscious, so the less like weird stuff we can use, the better for us. And secondly, it's just it's easier and it has a bit of a wow factor because we do actually print rules on the inside of our box. So that was kind of the equipment that we started with. That, and we just had like, the little tiny single shrink wrap machine that we got. And so as we grew, we really tried to find the right equipment that was going to do not only more of what we needed, but also like go in a better direction. So for example, unfortunately, shrink wrap you can't get in small quantities as a biodegradable shrink wrap. Is very, very difficult to find. If anybody wants a business idea, make biodegradable shrink wrap pouches, and I'm sure that you'll make a lot of money. That was one of the things is we had to upgrade to a full shrink wrap machine so that we could use this special biodegradable shrink wrap so that we had less of a footprint from our games. And so when we're, upgrading our equipment, we're getting new printers now with ink that not only we switched away from cartridges, so we're not using plastic cartridges. We now use like bottles of ink that we can then refill with. We're sourcing ink from Canada. We're trying to find like a good ink supplier here, so it's not, ink from overseas or whatever. Same for paper, as we found a place out of Ontario where we're ordering paper there. So as we upgrade our equipment, we can use different processes, and then we can slowly become more local and more eco-conscious. And that's kind of the direction we have headed in and are hoping to keep heading in that direction.
It sounds like a lot of the start involved quite a bit of trial and error.
Oh yeah, tons of trial and error. One of my favorite stories about the trial and error is the boxes. So I had to just basically design the boxes from scratch for the most part. So the first box design that we had was a little bit thicker. It was a single stack of cards. It was about 80 business cards. You would then fold this box around it and you would hook together the box to hold it together. And so that was an idea that had already been used by a lot of places. These hook tuck box designs has been used before. But we found oh man, the first, we probably made about 1,000, I would say, games with that tuck box at least. And we were getting tons of feedback from people. Two of the big pieces of feedback is, one, the hooks would rip. And second is that they were sometimes hard to hook together. One of the things that actually inspired us to okay, we got to fix this, and we didn't know how and we didn't know what to do. And I was talking to my brother, and we were at a market, and I was talking about how, it's so there's two separate problems. There's that problem, but also shipping these little things that cost $20 cost $15 to ship to, Selkirk. And we were like, there's got to be, some kind of solution. And my brother was like, well, why don't you just ship them flat? So you don't actually assemble the game. You just ship them flat so that you can fit them through the little Canada Post slot and mail them anywhere for $2. And so that two separate problems come together, and we go, wait, why don't we just redesign the whole box so that it's a flat pack box, and we can do a hook, or not a hook, a tuck box, just like you would find with a pack of playing cards. You find those nice moments where that problem solving, I often find whenever I hit a big problem and it's I am just deep in a problem, almost 100% of the time, on the other side of that problem, I have found a solution that changes not only that one thing, but many, many other things. So I actually find with a trial and error, it's a really good problem to have, because I think most people, when they go through a manufacturer, they don't have the same types of problems, and they're not thinking about the, nuts and bolts as much as we are. And I find at least that gets us to think more creatively and make cooler games, in my opinion.
Gives you a lot more hands-on control of every piece of the process.
Oh yeah, every single one. So we make them all, but then also it's just us, right? So it's we're, doing the accounting, we're doing all of the stuff, all the little bits, we got to do social, we got to do posting. We're very, very fortunate to have people in our lives who are supportive. My partner, my best friend's partner, are both just absolutely phenomenal with helping out with the business. Our families are great as well. So we're very fortunate in that sense. But really it is it's there's a lot of it that's incredible, but there's a lot of just logistical blah that I don't wish on anybody. So there's certainly, there's a cost to the dream.
Do you guys work out of a private place, or do you work at a home at the moment?
Literally my basement, which is an above ground. So literally we just have the printers there. We're printing the stuff there, cutting it there, assembling it there. We're hoping eventually to scale to the point where we can have a space that we can both access all the time. So we're lucky. We don't need a large space. It's literally just paper, printers, cutting machine. I can do it out of basically a 10-foot by 10-foot room right now. So that's the dream. We're hoping to get there maybe in the next year or two. But for right now, it's just we're still figuring out all of the kind of logistics around all of the games And I think once that we get there, that'll be the next step, and that's exciting.
Based off conversations we've had prior, it sounds like things are going pretty well for the operation at the moment. You were just in Indianapolis.
That one was just more of a, pleasure, but also for business. My best friend and I went down to a convention called Gen Con, which is, I think, North America's largest kind of board game tabletop convention. There might be larger ones, but it's huge. It's like 70,000 people. And this year it was sold out, which was apparently most years it doesn't fully sell out. So it was busy. But we actually were fortunate enough. We went there with another company and we were helping to promote their games. But while we were there, we got to connect with a lot of great people. We got to learn a lot about the industry. And for us, like that business end of things made it kind of like that was the business part of the trip for sure. But also like it's great when you're doing something that you enjoy because business trips or business things are also fun. So they're also kind of personal, right? Like it was just cool to be there and meet all these crazy people in the industry, which is important for the business, but also just cool. So it was definitely like that was a cool part and things are going quite well. And that certainly inspired us a lot to be thinking outside the box with how we're moving forward with it. It's always nice to kind of have a refresher and a reminder of how everybody else is doing things and how much different everybody else is doing things. And that there's really like an unlimited number of options out there and kind of being inspired to think outside the box again.
Where did you guys first start selling?
So literally farmers markets, like holy smokes, farmers markets have been great to us. Like one of the things that we really underestimated is the first time we sold our games, we went to a convention called PrairieCon, which is in Brandon. So we've now gone twice and I love it. It's a fantastic convention. But that was the first place that we sold our games. And we really thought at the start, like these games are for people who like games. Like we really didn't think that we'd be able to sell games to people who weren't quote unquote gamers. We went to PrairieCon and we like almost sold out of the games we had made for the convention. And we were like, okay, maybe this thing has some legs. And so David was like, well, why don't we start booking some farmers markets and see how it goes? And I was kind of like skeptical. I didn't think that people at a farmers market would want games. And then we started going to farmers markets. People were like, oh my God, this is like, I haven't seen anything like this. Like we really are product of one at a farmer's market. Like nobody else is hand making card games. That I think hooks people in. But then the biggest thing that I think helped us grow, especially at farmers markets, is just that I think a lot of people, whether they know it or not, are becoming kind of like disillusioned with where a lot of board games are headed. I think a lot of board games are headed to more rules, more pieces, more table presence. And I think that's great in the board game niche. But for average people, like when I go and hang out with people and I'm bringing board games from my collection to play with them, they're not set up on the table board games. They're silly, fun, goofy, shouted out, laughing, talking, not caring about score. They're that type of game. And so I think that's what really hooked people in to our games is that they're very easy to learn. So they can just play with the people that they're with and not worry about like playing a game. They can just be having fun doing this as an activity and not having to learn a bunch of rules up front. So in terms of starting at farmers markets, I think it was the perfect thing for us. It taught us how to talk about our games, how to explain them to people in the most concise way possible, and also that like, hey, there is a market out there. And if that market exists locally at a farmer's market, we at least are hoping that market will exist across the province, across the country is kind of our next goal of hitting more people like that in a wider range.
Mm-hmm. And to your point of what the typical person is looking for in a card game or a board game, I remember might have been a year ago playing a game and I was being explained the rules the entire time.
Oh, yeah.
And there were different rules every time.
Oh, yeah.
And by the end of the game, I didn't know what had happened other than I had lost.
Yes.
That is all I was aware of.
Surprisingly common. And I think there are certain people who, like, I do love playing a nice, in-depth game when I know the rules. I hate learning the rules. And then I love playing it after that. But also, a lot of the time, I don't want that. I just want to be silly. Like, there's a game that I love where you just have to give clues, but you can only use single-syllable words. And it's just such a silly, dumb game where you're just like goofing around and you have a big inflatable club you're whacking each other with. So it's just like it's not like a we need to score the most points game. It's just we're having fun and we're goofing around and we're creating a nice memory together, hanging out and enjoying each other's company and having something to kind of unite us around. that's kind of what we hope for with our games, is that they create those types of memorable moments. They don't need to have, incredible depth and strategy. They can just be light, silly fun, and that's good.
So how many markets do you think you've been to in the last year?
A lot. We do a lot of farmers markets. Last year, we really went crazy. So last year we were probably doing, I would say, like on an average for the summer, maybe like 3 to 4 markets a week. But then we'd also sometimes double book markets. So then that would be like, up to 6. Like we do a lot. This year we're focused less on like the weekly markets. We're doing a lot more variety, and we're trying a lot more different types of shows, which have been good and bad. We tried doing the Red River X, and we thought our stuff would be a perfect fit for the X, and it just wasn't the crowd, and you can't predict that. So we're trying to do some other kind of, I would say, bigger shows than kind of more local farmers markets, and we're seeing how it goes. But we have to experiment, right? We have to try doing other things, because there are certain places where what we found is anytime we go out of the city, we just do fantastic, and there's great reception. We'll go to Lac du Bonny, we'll go to St. Adolphe, and like, oh my God, these community markets, 1, are phenomenal. But 2, the reception there is fantastic. The people are great. They're receiving the games in such a great way. They're buying, which always helps. That's a really cool thing that we've realized. So as we go forward, we're kind of fine-tuning that as well. Which markets we're getting the most out of them, and we're finding the right crowds to kind of cater that towards it.
That's a good reason to be able to, or it's a good excuse, let's say, to get out to places that you might not otherwise get to. I do wonder, just off the top of my head, how much of that receptiveness in those small towns comes down to regular availability to games like that. Whereas here, you go to Kit and Caboodle and you'll get lost trying to find a game. Whereas you go to St. Adolphe, you're not going to run into the same kind of issue.
Yeah, that's very true.
So how many different games do you presently produce?
So we've got 10 right now, I believe, is our number. It's always changing. We have 10 right now. We are hoping to get at least another. I'm aiming for at least like 2 or 3 by the end of the year is kind of the hope. But we have lots of ideas. And one thing we're really learning this year is like when we're in the throes of market season, we don't have the time or energy to really be like making the design / like research of the games. So that's been really helpful as well this year. Is now that we've actually done a full year, we've realized, oh, okay, great. Maybe we're using that January to May time to make a bunch of games. And then we're using that May to December to go out and promote and sell those games and release them periodically is kind of what we might be hoping for into the future, which again, learning experience. This was our first year, right? It feels like we've been doing it for a while, but really we've just passed the year point, which is wild. So that's certainly, something that we've learned.
So I imagine ideas just kind of come to you from time to time. You might jot it down. Do you flesh those ideas out now, or are you looking to wait until the winter, your off season?
Honestly, like we flesh them out as much as we can, but a lot of the times, truthfully, like the game ideas that I tend to think about, because I have kind of trained my brain to simplify, it's very easy to kind of like understand the concept of the game. And it's more about the fleshing out, luckily, isn't about the rules or like testing of it. It's more about the like research to do the game. One of the examples that I can give is like one of the games that is kind of going to be upcoming for us is more of a puzzly game where there's a secret word and you have a bunch of little clues to try and guess that secret word, almost like little crossword clues, but all about the same thing. That as a concept is great. You don't have to like, we've tested it with a handful of people and it works and it's clear. The main thing is just like researching all of the different words to put into the game, right? So that I think is saved for the off season, but the actual like trying it out, making sure that it works, especially because they're so simple, like it's pretty easy to see, does it work? Is it fun? Spending that winter time fleshing it out, I think will hopefully be the goal. Kind
of fine tuning it a little more.
Yeah.
What would you say have been some of the biggest obstacles you've encountered so far?
That's a very good question. Honestly, the reception from people has been phenomenal. We really haven't struggled with like getting out there, talking to people, and just like everybody's so friendly. So that's been really helpful. But in terms of obstacles, like I would say 90% of the obstacles come down to like logistic problems. And they're always so like silly, dumb problems to have, right? Of like, okay, the paper that we're ordering isn't available. And now we're spending a week trying to find new paper, right? These are all problems that like people who get manufacturers don't have. But that's kind of the trade-off, right? And again, with those obstacles, I think any of those obstacles that have come up that I remember always lead us to something better. With a paper, like the paper we were ordering, they just would run out periodically. So that got us to then look for a better paper supplier. And our original one was in the States and our new one is in Canada. So that was a great thing where it was like, this problem resulted in us getting something better. Like the solution really improved our business. Certainly like a lot of those types of obstacles, again, that's all the logistic like junk that you just kind of have to do running a business. And I think there are a lot of people who enjoy that part. I don't at all. Like I just want to be making the games. The obstacles that come up for us most of the time, even going forward, will just be those silly little things. And that's just part of running a business and technically being a manufacturer. Like we are technically a manufacturer, right? So that's just part of the problem of it.
Do you ever feel like you're approaching a moment where you're going to have to start perhaps hiring a couple staff or substantially changing the way you produce games, perhaps to increase in efficiency or anything like that? Or does that still feel pretty far down the road?
When we first started looking at it, it seemed like it was coming up quickly. But after running the numbers, I don't think it is coming up quickly. One of the great things is like with all of these issues, we've slowly like fine-tuned the process so the game making is more efficient. As an example, when I'm cutting boxes, like I'm sticking a paper to a pad, loading it up into one, sticking another paper, loading up into another machine. I've got two machines going, and then the boxes that I've just peeled off, I'm folding while the other boxes are being cut so that I'm not wasting time some other time folding a bunch of boxes. So there's like a lot of those little things that like we're becoming more efficient at making the games, which is great. But after running the numbers, like my best friend and I could be doing like, we could just be making games, like physically making games 40 hours a week. And I think we'd both be pretty happy with that for the next like little while, just because we fine-tune the process enough that it isn't as much of a burden, I think, as we must imagined it to be. Maybe one day, down the road, we'll hire somebody to help with some of those things. But for right now, I think like we're still got a while to scale before we hit that point.
Having been at it for a year, that's plenty of time to learn those little tricks of the trade. Save that 5 seconds here. By the end of the day, who knows how much time you've actually saved. Yeah. Now, I've known you for a number of years now, and one thing that sticks out about you more than anything is just how creative you are. When I first met you, you were a writer, a published writer, and you write shows for Fringe. You've participated in multiple Fringe festivals. You write musicals, all of which are hilarious. Have you always been this creative?
I would say like, yeah. So I grew up with a brother who's like almost 2 years younger than me. And I think a lot of the creativity just comes from the fact that like we would both want our parents' attention all the time. So we would really have to like learn how to fight for that attention. And I think creativity is a very easy way of fighting for attention. Humor in the same sense, right? You're constantly trying to get in with that joke to like get the positive rush of like, oh, people like me. So I think that's part of what made me so creative. But also like my parents were very creative people and we were raised to embrace our creativity and really like do creative activities as opposed to just like, single-minded kind of activities. So I think that has been a part of it, just like ever since being a kid. That is just the thing that was rewarded and encouraged. And so naturally, I think I fall into that. But I think the other part of that is just like I've had a lot of privilege to be able to do things artistically for this long. Like the ability to do a musical is like, that's huge, right? Like just having the time and the resources to pull that together for the first time is like crazy. I think that's another huge aspect of it is just like, I am in a very unique, privileged situation where I am the type of person who like, I don't really go beyond my means in the kind of basic things in my life so that I can have the scrounge in a way to do the creative stuff. I think a lot of it's luck, but also a lot of it's just like what was encouraged when I was a child is kind of what led me to always be thinking of different ideas.
Mm-hmm. And I can't help but thinking that also just having such a track record of following through on such big endeavors like the musicals and stuff like that. And I can't help but feel like that's going to pay off huge at this point in your life with what you're presently doing.
Yeah, I hope it does. But I mean, like, one of the big things that I find at least is with a lot of the creative endeavors that I do, a lot of the times learning the new stuff that makes me more creative, that I find at least, is just like the logistical, like, oh, well, you got to figure it out. Like when we wanted to write a musical, it's like, well, how are we going to do that? And at the time I was writing with a friend who was an absolute musical savant, but I still needed to know enough of the stuff to like do some of the like tech things or this or that, blah, blah, blah. So then it's suddenly like, okay, now I'm learning how to use Logic so I can record audio. And then that slowly becomes, okay, now I'm learning how to use a keyboard to input, MIDI tracks into the computer and change the instrument so it sounds like, a trumpet or drums or whatever it is from this keyboard. So all those skills that I think are the things that like make me kind of creative are all just those little things that like you have to learn to do the thing that you want to do. And eventually you just learn enough of them that you're like, okay, now if I wanted to do something, I have the skills to do that. And I can just kind of dive right in and start, which is one of the things that I think prevents most people from doing creative things is they look at the thing and they're like, it's so big because I have to learn so much stuff to do it. Once you've learned the stuff, it's like, yeah, it's big, but like I've done it before, / I've done similar things. So why couldn't I just do this? I think that's a big kind of thing that I think about a lot. And I think that prevents a lot of people from doing the creative things that they could do, is just that like insurmountable, oh my God, I have to learn so much stuff to do this.
And looking at the whole, it's so intimidating, but when you break it down into the pieces, it becomes very achievable and attainable.
Breaking down to pieces is huge. Like if you just like sat down and you like, I think a lot of people want to write a book. And if you just like sat down and looked at it and you're like, oh, I really only have to write like this many chapters. And then you look at like the word count for a chapter and you're like, I really only have to write this many paragraphs or whatever it is. Like it's really not that much when you actually sit back and look at it. And especially for the first time, I think people are looking at things and they're like, I have to do this perfectly. It's like, no, you shouldn't actually. You should like really do this badly the first time you do it, because that's the only way that you're actually going to learn how to do the stuff. Then when you know how to do the stuff, that's when you're going to learn how to do it well. And I think that catches a lot of people as well. Is like, if you just break something down into the steps and just do it and do them badly and figure it out, then the next time you do it, you're going to just naturally do it a lot better. And it's not going to seem as hard. It's going to actually seem quite easy in comparison because you know the steps already.
So at this point in time, with you guys working on your games, I imagine you want to strike while the iron is hot. But do you ever long for those days of creative writing or writing musicals or anything like that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm still doing a whole bunch of stuff. That's part of like the blessing and the curse of like, being somebody who's always thinking of a bunch of ideas. Seems like, oh, that's awesome, but it's also like, oh, then I want to constantly doing like 100 different things at once. So it's quite hard to focus on any one thing specifically. So with the games, like, yeah, we're spending a lot of time doing it, but it's not like all consuming. David has a child, like he's literally raising a child as we're growing this business. It's like we both have our own things kind of going on. So there is still like lots of time for me at least to like set aside to do the other creative things that I want to be doing, because that's something that fulfills me. And for me, it's like I need to be doing all of the things that fulfill me, or else I'll kind of just feel bad because I'm not living up to some of my potential.
Coming to the end here, is there a particular game that you've made that is your favorite?
I mean, I really like Syllabuster. I think it's just been hitting so well. My partner thought of the name and I love the name. It's so simple. And there's like a couple things that I look for, like party games, and I think it checks a lot of the boxes. I love an all-play game. I love a game where even the person who's like reading the card can still participate and everybody plays at once. You're not waiting for a turn. I think that's huge. It's super underrated for a game. I love that it's like easy to understand. Like every time I say you have to think of an answer with more syllables, people's eyes like open and they're like, oh, I get it. Like there's an epiphany every time I teach the game. That's certainly, I think, the one that I'm happiest right now, I think is just like that, like, aha, that's a very hard thing to find. But also, like, I'm happy with a lot of games that, like, kind of we thought of. They're all very different and for different situations. And so a game, I don't think it's like a one size fits all where a lot of people have a favorite game. It's like, well, that won't work with a lot of the groups that you play it with. So I have a lot of game ideas that I'm proud of in different ways. I think definitely Syllabuster is the favorite at the moment, but I'm sure within a year, I'm sure we'll have another game that's out that has a, similar feel to me where it's like, oh, this is a new exciting thing and people are liking it. So I think that helps as well.
So let's say we're talking on this day 1 year from now. Where do you hope to be?
That's a good question. So this day, a year from now, we're going to go through our Christmas rush, which is going to be, if it's anything like last year, it's going to just be bonkers. So that's going to be a lot. Our games are very good, like size for people to use as stocking stuffers. So as soon as like September, October rolls around, people are just like, oh, perfect. I'll buy 5 and give them to all my family and friends. So that's going to be very busy for us. Once we get through that, I'm hoping we spend the early part of next year making a lot of new games that we can release throughout the year. That's a huge thing. And the second aspect of it is I want to start growing online more. I want to try and grow a presence on some short form content because I think that this is something like I like makers content and this is a very unique type of makers content. So I'm really trying to figure out how to create content that will like hit people and show them like, hey, look, we're doing this thing that you are familiar with, but we're doing it in a different way. Because I think ultimately, a year from now, I think we're going to hopefully take some steps towards that ultimate goal, which that ultimate goal down the road is like, we're really changing how games are made. And I think right now it's just like 99.9% is like, get it made in China and get it shipped here. And for us, it's like, what if we just did it here? What if we didn't do all this crazy ship? What if we just made them here and we ship them out from here? Like, would that be too much to ask? So I think that's kind of our long-term goal is just like more localized, more like local made goods, more people caring and having their hands in the pot as opposed to just like making something and sending it off. And hopefully that in the next year will help take those small steps towards that longer goal.
Well, Connor, thanks so much for coming on the show. Where can people find your games?
So our company is called Glass Jar Games. So you can go to glassjargames.ca. People always ask, and we're going to put games in glass jars to start off. We're going to put them in like honey jars. So that's where the name comes from. Thinking outside the box. You can go to glassjargames.ca, check them out. We also have handles all over the place at Glass Jar Games. Pretty much wherever you look, you'll find it. All of our games are on our website and they ship for free anywhere in Canada. So that's something that we're really happy with. As I explained with the box design, that's something we can do now is free shipping anywhere in Canada. So yeah, if you want to check them out, that's where you can find them.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in. Today's show was brought to you by myself, Matthew Harrison, as well as Ryan Funk, and we're working out of Multicultural Studios. I hope you tune again for another conversation from the heart of Canada.